Legislative Audit Commission will come to order. Members, we are going to try to be done at 10. So we have about 1 hour. This is a very important audit. We do have members who are participating virtually. I want maybe we just the record to show who's here virtually as well. So with that, Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor. I want to say thank you for having this hearing of our performance audit on the Minnesota Frontline Worker Pay Program. As you likely know, the 2022 legislature established Minnesota's Frontline Worker Pay Program, and its goal was to provide payments to frontline workers whose work put them at risk of contracting COVID-19 during the peacetime emergency. As you probably know, the legislature appropriated $500 million to be paid to eligible applicants who worked in frontline sectors, and the law defined what those frontline sectors were. In the end, the state paid more than 1 million applicants, a little more than $475 each, I think $487 and some change. That same law encouraged the Office of the Legislative Auditor to conduct an audit, so here we are. Determining eligibility for this program in particular, as compared with many other state programs, was difficult because some of the eligibility criteria established in the law are not known to state government. For example, the eligibility criteria established in law included things such as whether the applicant had to work in person, and if they were working in person, whether the applicant had to work in close proximity to individuals outside of their immediate household. As part of the application process, applicants self-certified their eligibility on these dimensions. The Department of Labor and Industry, DOLI, accepted applicants' self-attestation for these items. But OLA looked for other ways to verify this information. As auditors, we simply cannot rely on self-attestation. In the end, we were able to confirm eligibility for about 60% of the applicants who received a frontline worker payment. However, for the remaining 40% of paid applicants, we either could not confirm their eligibility or we determined that they were in fact not eligible to receive the payment. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that 40% of paid applicants were ineligible, but it also doesn't mean that the 40% were eligible and OLA auditors are just super nitpicky, which may also be true, but that's not an excuse for the 40%. Really, the truth lies somewhere in the middle as to the extent to which they were eligible and we couldn't confirm it or they were ineligible. I think it's also important to note that we identified paid applications that had clear fraud indicators, and we identified paid applications for which we could clearly determine the applicant was not eligible. For example, applications submitted by people who had died before the application window opened. Now remember, this program was set up as a zero-sum game with a fixed amount of state funding, $500 million, to be divided equally among all eligible applicants. The more applicants who were approved, the less each applicant received. In other words, for this program, each ineligible applicant who received payment necessarily reduced the amount of the payment that eligible applicants could receive. As you will see in the report and hear from Mr. Baker, we present 3 different eligibility projections based on 3 different sets of assumptions. We presented these 3 projections so that each of you can decide which assumptions you believe are the most reasonable. Across those 3 projections, you will see that the one thing that is consistent is that 60% figure. Again, we could confirm eligibility for just under 60% of the applicants who received a payment, and regardless of which set of assumptions you use, we couldn't go any further than that. Now, as with all of the reports that OLA issues, our hope with this report is to help make sure that state funds are being used as intended and to help government work better. So to that end, we have recommendations for the Departments of Labor and Industry, Department of Revenue, Minute, but we also have a recommendation for the legislature. When the program was being discussed at the legislature in 22, Commissioner Blissenbach and others identified some of the risks associated with some of these eligibility criteria, and she noted the possibility of using self-attestation. And it appears that at that time, the legislature was willing to accept those hypothetical risks. Now we are here 2 years later, and those risks are no longer hypothetical. Through our audit, we have confirmed that many of those risks were realized. So as the legislature continues to do its good work and create new programs in the future, we think it would really be prudent for the legislature to keep in the forefront the balance between expediency and accuracy. And we think it's really important for the legislature to clearly understand the risks that it's accepting. So after that high-level thing, I'm going to now turn to Mr. Baker, who will walk through the findings and recommendations in more detail. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Welcome, Mr. Baker. If you can state your name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Ryan Baker, Audit Director within the Financial Audit Division. Today, I'm presenting the results of our audit of the Minnesota Frontline Worker Pay Program, which was released just earlier today. Before I get into the presentation, I want to thank the team who put a lot of their time into the audit. Holly Ruinia, Crystal Nibby, Nicole Hegum, Emily Wyant, Bria Bawick, Joe Sass, David Kirchner, and Kyle Malone. The legislature approved the Minnesota Frontline Worker Pay Program in early 2022. The program was intended to provide payments to workers whose job put them at risk of contracting COVID-19. A maximum of $1,500 was available to each worker depending on the number of applicants. I'll now go over the funding for the program, the applicants who received a frontline worker payment, and the entities responsible for implementing the program. As mentioned by Ms. Randall, the legislature appropriated $500 million for frontline worker payments, with $11.65 million to fund the cost of implementing the program. Of the $500 million appropriated for frontline worker payments, nearly all of it was spent to 1 million applicants that were deemed eligible for payment. As a result, the expected benefit payment dropped from $1,500 to $487.45. A total of 1.2 million individuals applied for a frontline worker payment. 1 million applicants were deemed eligible and received a payment, and 184,000 applicants were denied or withdrew their application. So in other words, 85% of applicants received a payment and 15% did not. The Department of Labor and Industry led the program with assistance of the Departments of Employment and Economic Development, Revenue, and Minnesota IT Services. The Department of Labor and Industry and Minnesota IT Services contracted with a company called Submittable to develop and administer the frontline worker application. Submittable then contracted with 2 subcontractors, Authenticate and Verif, to perform identity verification services for applicants. Authenticate provided the knowledge-based authentication option, and Verif provided the image verification option. All applicants must have completed the knowledge-based authentication, which was the 5-question quiz administered by Authenticate, or by taking a picture of themselves and a picture of an identification document through Verif's platform. Throughout the presentation, I'll refer to the 4 agencies involved as DOLI, Minute, DOR, and DEED. The first objective of our audit was to determine whether the 4 agencies complied with significant legal requirements to accurately determine eligibility for the program. The second main objective was to determine whether DOLI and Minute complied with significant legal requirements related to third-party contracts. The scope of our audit was May 9th, 2022 through the end of the payment processing period, December 30th, 2022. So here are the bottom line findings of our audit. DOLI did not comply with requirements for the program, specifically related to the eligibility of individuals who received a payment. DOR did not verify adjusted gross income for all applicants. DOLI and Minute did not comply with the state's Official Records Act, specifically related to the retention of data. And finally, DEED did comply with program requirements related to unemployment insurance benefits. Now I'm going to go into the eligibility requirements specified in law and our testing of the eligibility of individuals. For an applicant to be eligible for a frontline worker payment, they must have met several requirements in law and certified that they met those requirements. Those requirements were that the applicant must have been employed for at least 120 hours in the state in a frontline sector. The applicant must have worked in person for at least 120 hours. The applicant must have worked in close proximity for at least 120 hours. The applicant must have met adjusted gross income requirements for tax years 2020 or 2021. And finally, the applicant couldn't have not received an unemployment benefit payment or serve a non-payable week for more than 20 weeks. Next, I'll get into the eligibility testing we performed and some of the sources and methods we used to verify eligibility requirements. We tested a random sample of 300 applications against the requirements in law. 150 of those applicants received a frontline worker payment without having to appeal any of their application. The other 150 were initially denied and then passed on appeal and received a payment. To conduct our testing, we use various state systems and other sources to test the eligibility of the individuals. For example, DEED's unemployment insurance system, DOR's tax system, and appeal documentation submitted by the applicant. In addition, in order to test the eligibility requirements to the extent possible, we took the additional step of reaching out to employers via a survey for each applicant. That is because we could verify eligibility requirements that could not be validated against state systems, such as working in person and working in close proximity for 120 hours. As auditors, we determined that we absolutely cannot rely on the applicant's self-attestation that they meet those requirements, especially when the applicant has a financial benefit to receive a payment. Finally, we took no assumptions, absolutely no assumptions that what the applicant stated was correct. For example, if an applicant indicated they were a nurse, we didn't just assume that they worked in person for at least 120 hours, because that nurse could have been a triage nurse who worked remotely for the required time frame. So the results of our sample testing determined that a significant number of applicants were ineligible, or we could not determine the eligibility for the applicants. A few findings that we found were we identified several applicants who reported no adjusted gross income in the state's tax system or the documentation they submitted during the appeal period. Thus, we could not determine the applicant's adjusted gross income. Based on those results, we were able to expand this to the entire population of paid applicants and identified approximately 28,000 applicants that DOR did not verify adjusted gross income for. Other examples of why applicants were determined to be ineligible were because they did not work in close proximity for 120 hours according to their employer, or they were not required to work in person for 120 hours. Next, I'll talk about the targeted testing areas that we looked at. In this area, we tested 550 applications. During this part of the audit, we identified groupings of applicants that were unique when compared to the other applicants who received a frontline worker payment. These targeted areas we looked into further were applicants who used disposable emails, that is, emails that can be used temporarily or also be used for the purposes of committing fraud. Applicants who use duplicate identification numbers, such as social security numbers and ID numbers. Applicants using identities of deceased individuals. Applicants claiming to provide COVID-19 patient care, but likely did not. Applicants who listed non-Minnesota residential and employer addresses, and applicants who included information on their application that contained fraud indicators. To conduct this testing, we used some of the same sources as our sample testing, including DEED's unemployment insurance system and DOR's tax system. In addition, we used the Department of Health's publicly available death records to identify deceased individuals who possibly received a frontline worker payment. Examples of our findings in these areas do include applicants that received a frontline worker payment by using the identity of a deceased individual, and applicants that received two payments because they used a duplicate identification number. Now I want to go into a little bit more of the detailed testing we did to identify applications that contained indicators of fraud. We performed significant data analysis and research to identify high-risk routing numbers in applications that contain suspicious data on their application. Our testing of applications found that applicants often use high-risk routing numbers routing numbers associated with peer-to-peer payment applications, and other routing numbers in which the applicant included suspicious data on their application. In combination with those groupings, examples of common fraud indicators that we found were applications with randomized emails, applications completed in the same routing number that used applicant names, first names that started with the same letter, and continued sequentially. For example, a first name would start with MA, continue on MB, MC, and so on. In addition, those same applications that started with the same letter often were submitted in quick succession, such as within minutes or even within seconds of each other. We also identified applications with the same employer name listed the exact same way across multiple applications, along with the same job titles, and also using unincorporated residential addresses for the employer address on the application. For example, an employer may be based in the Twin City area, but the applicant used a residential address for an unincorporated community in northern Minnesota. A portion of these applications also use the same bank account to receive more than one payment. Finally, in the graphic shown to you, we noticed a technique that has been known to be used by bad actors. We found the deliberate use of the same email addresses, but broken up in different ways. For example, an individual takes a normal looking Gmail address, such as johndoe@gmail.com, and then creates new email addresses by simply inserting periods in the email in different spots. Google does not recognize these emails as a separate email, and any communication goes back to the original email address without the periods. Now that I've talked about our eligibility testing, I wanted to get into the audit projections that Ms. Randall mentioned earlier. We projected the results of our sample testing and targeted testing to the entire 1 million paid applicants and projected the results in 3 different ways. Across the 3 projections, the only thing that was consistent is the estimate that 59% of paid applicants were eligible to receive a payment. The differences in the 3 projections comes down to whether or not we accept the employer survey responses as accurate. As an example, if an employer indicated an applicant did not work in close proximity to individuals for at least 120 hours, we consider that applicant as ineligible in projection number 1. In projection number 2, we say that we cannot determine the eligibility for that applicant because the employer survey response contradicts the information the applicant provided on their application. And then finally, in projection number 3, that applicant would also be included in the cannot determine eligibility group if the only reason they would be ineligible is due to the requirement that they did not work in close proximity for 120 hours, according to their employer. However, if the employer also indicated for that projection that the applicant was not required to work in person, for example, or is not an employee, for an example, we consider that applicant as ineligible in projection number 3. So based on these projections and the issues identified in our eligibility testing, we have a number of recommendations. We recommend DOR recoup payments to ineligible individuals and individuals who use the identity of another individual to receive payment. Next, we recommend Dolly review all applications with fraud indicators to determine whether frontline worker payments were made to ineligible individuals. Finally, we recommend DOR use additional methods to verify adjusted gross income for applicants who did not report their adjusted gross income for 2020 or 2021. Also, as Ms. Randall mentioned earlier in her remarks, we also have a recommendation for the legislature. We recommend the legislature consider the amount of risk the state is willing to accept when establishing programs quickly and with eligibility conditions that can rely on self-attestation. Now I'm going to switch gears and start talking about the findings related to data retention we found. As a reminder, Submittable provided administration of the application and was involved in processing payments to applicants with the help of the state agencies and US Bank. Also, to reiterate, Authenticate and Verif provided identity verification services. Authenticate administered that knowledge-based quiz, and Verif provided the image verification option. In our review of the state's contract with Submittable and Submittable's contracts with Authenticate and Verif, data retention provisions did not exist, or if they did, the data was not properly retained. As an example, Authenticate was not required to retain any of the questions and answers from a knowledge-based quiz for any applicant. But Verif was required to retain photos and identification documents for up to 3 years. In addition, Authenticate promptly deleted all questions and answers to all the quizzes taken for the entire population, approximately 2 weeks after payments were processed. We also found that Dolly's retention schedule did not require the state hold on to third-party contractor data that was necessary in making program decisions for this program, even though the state maintained other sensitive applicant data in accordance with the retention schedule. As a result of these inconsistencies, we have a few recommendations related to data retention. We recommend Dolly and Minute include data retention core requirements in all contracts. Second, we recommend Dolly and Minute ensure data that is necessary in making program decisions is appropriately retained by all parties in accordance with contract provisions. Third, we recommend that Dolly and Minute require destruction of that data when it's no longer used or necessary. And lastly, we recommend to Dolly that third-party data be included in its retention schedules. So with that, that concludes my presentation. We're open up for any questions.
Thank you. And I want to note, members that are participating online are Senator Barr, Representative Lee, Senator Drazkowski, and Senator Dibble. Members, are there any questions? Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Baker, in your findings that are, there's so many things here to go through. One of at the high level, from a contracting perspective, it sounds like we contracted with a variety of contractors and subcontractors, and the information, we either weren't clear in the contracting, in the contracts about data retention, capture, right, publicly or personally identifiable information. It appears all of them collected some portion of that. And only one of them retained it for a short period of time until, what was it, the facial recognition verified it, but discarded it 2 weeks after the refunds were issued or the payments were issued. Did any of that, was there any responses from the agencies about why we didn't follow basic standard procedures? That should have been a copy, cut, and paste from all of our existing agency standards, or to apply or to meet those standards, since they're functioning as a contractor and subcontractor of a state agency. Was any of that part of your conversation or the review of this report?
Mr. Baker or Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Karan. Yes, we did have conversations with Dolly and Minute on this point. So a couple things to note. Both Minute and Dolly said to us, and I believe it's in one of the letters at the back of the report, that they didn't think the questions and answers were essential to the program, to operating the program. What they said was important was, who it was, and then the percentage of answers they got right, because that was going to be the determination of whether they were who they said they were. And so we just disagree with the agency on that point, and I'm sure they're here and can talk to that. The reason why we disagree is because we can't check that process then, right? There was no way for not just us, but for Dolly, right, or others to check, to make sure that the process was working the way it was supposed to. And we had special concerns around the knowledge assessment, because that was by and far the primary way that applicants who had fraud indicators or who we could determine were not eligible, they used that knowledge assessment to verify their identity. So the inability for us to test it or for Dolly to test it was concerning. Regarding Verif, that was when folks used the photo ID to prove that they were who they were. And they did have data retention provisions in that contract, and Verif did have most of them, but when we requested, I believe 37 just to test, and they could not provide it for 7 of those 37, one of whom was somebody who had died before the application window began. And so, I mean, this kind of illustrates why it's important to keep that information, right? So we can have some of these checks, again, not just for audit purposes, but for the agency to manage it. So that was a long-winded answer, but we did have a lot of conversations around that with them.
Senator
Thank
Cran.
thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Randall and or Mr. Baker. Were those contracts sole source or were they actually bid? Any of the contracts?
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. I don't believe I know that answer. I think we have to go to defer to the agency on that.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you.
Senator Cran.
Mr. Chair, and then, so working in the discovery within the agencies or the work you've done, we could only verify certainly affirm that 10% of the payments went out to ineligible people. Which agencies have taken the lead, or what actions have you determined that have been put in place to recapture those payments from ineligible people?
Mr. Baker or Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Karan. We have had conversations with Revenue and we plan to provide them the detailed information that we have on the applicants that we have concerns about related to fraud indicators. And my understanding is that they will be working to investigate those and recover those. And, you know, Commissioner Marquardt is here and he can talk about that. We will also be reaching out to some other law enforcement folks and sharing the information we've collected.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Grant.
Quick follow-up. So, at this point, you're not aware of any of the agencies taking actions today outside of what the Office of the Legislative Auditor report will provide of the ineligible applicants to seek recapture. I mean, because I think the average citizen in one sense could look and say, well, these things are costly and expensive and they're small dollars and we would have a difficult time or it's expensive to recover it. But we also have a revenue recapture program where it's pretty easy to reestablish that liability at the Department of Revenue and recapture any future payment pending or credit or refundable credit or on any subsequent tax return for many years. So we have the lowest cost opportunity. And so just want to affirm that none of the agencies took any effort up to this point to recapture any of the or have discovered any on their own of ineligible payments that they've stopped and or recaptured.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. From my understanding, they have recouped some of those payments. I can't confirm how many at this point. Or, you mentioned the revenue process of recouping. I could just mention that some of these may not be individuals in the state, so they might have a harder time recouping, but I'll let them kind of speak to that recoupment process.
Senator Cran, last follow-up.
Mr. Chair, sorry.
Or Ms. Randall.
Thank you. If I could just add, I also know, and again, the Commissioner of Dolly is here to speak to it too, that they did conduct some of their own work to identify fraud and work to recoup some of that as well.
Senator Cran.
If they get the last follow-up, and Ms. Randall or Mr. Baker, you mentioned at the high level, you will be working with law enforcement, that you've identified some anomalies in those to go out and seek. Was that in the outbound payment, the organized crime? Without giving it away, again, you've located or your work has discovered those things that would warrant engagement of law enforcement for further review. Are you aware of the agencies having any referrals to law enforcement prior to your report coming out?
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. To your last part, I'm not aware of any conversations they've had. And then speaking to your earlier part, sorry, I forgot what your earlier part was.
Senator Cran.
From a law enforcement perspective, there's a reference that
Yeah.
you've seen many scenarios which lead you to engage law enforcement. Were you aware of any of the agencies that had engaged law enforcement on their own for similar suspected fraud or criminal activities?
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. No, not aware of any. And a lot of the research we did identify some of those routing numbers that payments were being made to. They have shown up in other states with being associated with fraud losses related to unemployment insurance. We did a lot of research early on that frankly was available before the program had started. You have Secret Service bulletins of different frauds occurring in some of these rally numbers, Department of Justice. So we definitely looked at a lot of research material and could not link it to any organized crime, but there was same routing numbers associated with some of the activity.
Representative Greenman and then Representative Quam.
Thank you. Sure. So I want to sort of go back to ground us in this. We're in a Senate hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will remember to turn on my mic. Ground us in, I think, the decision that we were making on this policy. I sat on this conference committee, so deeply aware of both the policy decisions and the discussions we had. And so when we talked about risk, I think that, and my questions are more in the methodology, which I think stray from the risk assessments and the decisions we made. We were talking about not just risk that ineligible folks would get a payment, but also the risk that would attach with eligible people not being able to get payments. Also, and I think reminding folks that we're in the middle of a pandemic. This, the original 250 million of this passed 8 months before. And so there was an urgency, I think everybody around the table felt, about getting the money to the folks who needed it quickly, and feeling like we're about a year behind. And so as we were making decisions, I think it was grounded in that. I don't think if we were setting up a program that was going to be developed in perpetuity, I think we would maybe have a different system. And we may not worry that it's going to take 8 months, a year to get a payment out. But I think as we think about these workers, we think about the income eligibility and what this money was for in terms of exposure to COVID, and filling some of the gaps that the rest of our systems left out. And so I say that because I have a few questions just on this chart and on the OLA couldn't determine eligibility question, because we had a very a long, and I think over a set of conference committee discussions about how to verify. So there was a set of metrics that government could verify, and whether it was through the UI system, whether it was the tax system. And then there was this close proximity question and the in-person work question. And those we all acknowledged, and we had many hearings about how we do that and who contains that information, right? The government doesn't. Presumably the two folks who would have access to that information obviously is the employee, may or may not be the employer based on how someone was managed. And we also were in an environment where we had some questions about employer management, particularly on the making people come into work, because at that point there was a federal requirement that if folks could work from home, they should be allowed to. And we had a lot of issues with folks being pressured to come in, but not necessarily wanting to. And so all of this was the dynamic that we made the decision that we put into the bill. And I pulled up the bill because as I was thinking about it, a requirement that an individual must certify to the Commissioner of Labor that the individual meets the eligibility criteria. So the self-certification of those two criteria. And when I read that, and as I read, and I want to make sure I'm clear, but these projections, this OLA could not determine eligibility is because, and this is my first question, this means that you couldn't determine it based on the employee's self-certification alone, is why the OLA couldn't determine eligibility. Am I correct on that?
Mr. Baker or Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. No, that's not completely the reason. So if the employer didn't respond to the survey, or if they responded don't know to a question or a requirement, then they would also be included in that group.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you. I guess that wasn't the question I asked, but that's interesting information. So what I was asking is, the law specifically did not, and we talked about this, did not ask for or require employer certification. The law was set up, we could have done built the program a different way. The payments could have come through employers. And we specifically wanted it to be a direct payment to workers. And rely on the two pieces of information we're talking about, the 120 hours of close proximity, and the in-person work. We thought and made the policy decision, after a lot of conversation, that those were things that sat with and that the employee was the best able to be able to answer. And so I guess what I'm asking, so what I hear you saying is this number, whether it's 32% or 40% or 38% of OLE could not determine, is a combination of places where we asked an employer, which is, and so that's my first question, and either where the employer said no, or whether the employer just didn't respond. Is that correct?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Greenman. And I appreciate the questions. And I think it is really important to go back to what the law required. I also brought it with me. And so there were kind of two parts. There was the self-certification part that the applicant did. And that was to say, I'm certifying that, I meet all of the eligibility criteria. It was not specific to the 120 hours or the in-person. And then we have all the eligibility requirements for the individuals. And the law does give the departments some discretion, right? Because this is tricky to certify, to figure out. And so it says, to the extent possible, right? The commissioners of revenue, deed, and DOLI must verify applicant eligibility for a payment under this section. And so it says, okay, agencies, to the extent possible, do it, right? It doesn't say you can rely just on the self-attestation. It doesn't say you can't. It just says to the extent possible. And so from an audit standpoint, what we would say is to the extent possible is more than just self-attestation. There should be some additional testing, even if it's just on a sample, even if it's just, let's pull some of the high-risk people that we can identify through data analytics, and let's pull a sample of those and talk to an employer, try to get some additional information, look up the employer's address on Google and see if it matches up, do something more. So I think this is going to be a reasonable, people will disagree, which is why we put out the 3 different projections, but it's what's to the extent possible. What does that mean? For us, it meant we asked the employer to confirm what the applicant told us. And if it didn't match, then again, that's where that could not determine eligibility piece resides. And I guess I will also say this, if they said yes, we always accepted that. So we didn't question if they said yes. We didn't question if they said, yep, they work 120 hours and they're in person. But if they said no, they weren't required to work in person, or no, they weren't required to work in close proximity, or don't know, or left parts of it blank, but they responded at least in some way, then that's when they went into one of those 3 different buckets of the could not determine.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you. So then I guess I have some questions about the survey and again, the conversations with employers, because I think that this gets to fundamentally the concerns that we had about and the reason that we talked about self-certification. And so again, as a worker, presumably and again, this was now a year and a half after we started debating the policy. And so presumably it could have been a year after people had been in that experience for workers. This is now, when you all talked to employers, it was probably like 4 years after. But had this process gone, it was, or 3 years. But when you reach out to employers, one of there's a few issues when we talked about employer verification, but I'm interested in how you verified or what questions you asked, what conversations you had with these employers to verify their relationship with that specific worker and their work environment to ensure that they actually had personal and documented knowledge of that 120 hours and that in-person work, and if they provided that documentation to you.
Mr. Baker or Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So as you can see on the survey,
See, it's on the appendix.
in the appendix, sorry, of the report, we did have lines for additional comments, and then they would list out their position duties, what they did. Some cases they attached a whole position description as well in the response. So they would explain what that person did, whether they are in person, close proximity to other individuals or not. And they would explain why not in a lot of cases. Sometimes they would just say, no, they didn't work in close proximity. And then occasionally, yeah, if we had questions on their responses to something conflicted, one response conflicted with another, then we would call that individual on the survey, follow up with that individual and ask them, hey, this is how you responded. Can you provide further clarification, information as to these requirements? So that was kind of our process when we did get the surveys.
Representative Greenman, one more, and then I want to get to Representative Quam and.
Thank you. I guess to the point of what you just described, what I don't hear is verification that the person, like if it was an AJR department or whoever, actually had personal knowledge of those working conditions. But I actually just ask those questions because I think that they illustrate this question of trade-off and this question that we were talking about, which is over 1 million people got payments under this. And that was an indication of how many of frontline workers. And I think, 20% were healthcare workers, manufacturing workers, meat packers, food service workers, all of these folks who are working during the pandemic. And I think if even a survey like this, which I think I would, this to me makes the calculation of preference that we're trusting what an employer who sends back has over someone who's self-certifying. Now, if we were to have put a policy like this, I think we would have demanded that then there was an appeals process so that if there was a conflict between employers' surveys and the self-certification, that then there was appeals process. We would have also had to deal with, I think you said 30% of folks who didn't respond. And when we talk about 1 million people, to me, that starts to look at and sound like, I think, something we all worry about, but probably tens of millions of dollars in processing this. And I also want to remind us that what the bill required was that nobody could get a payment until everybody's eligibility was determined. And so if we had run a system like this and done it the right way, which is to ensure that we actually were identifying the employer, their personal knowledge, some documentation that they actually could speak to these issues of, like they were direct supervisor, for instance, as opposed to, an HR department at a hospital. I think we would need all of that. We would to have built out the resources to verify all of that. And also to do this appeals process. And to me, and I think we actually had that conversation about that's a year and a half out of building infrastructure. Now, if we were to be setting up a program that was intended to be indeterminate or in perpetuity, it probably would have made sense for us to have an agency set that up. But I think when we're talking about this one-time system, I'm very concerned that that sort of the audit makes, or some of the tools make actually assessments that we determined and rejected in the policymaking process, whether it's employer verification, whether it's the risk assessment of just the timeliness of getting stuff out. And so it sort of makes judgments and recommendations, I think, by not actually being rooted in both the policy and the long conversation that we had. And so those are my concerns just to start, but I will make sure folks other.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there are a few things that make me wonder across multiple areas, not just this. Silly me thought that one of the first prime steps is verifying an applicant wasn't deceased. And that's a very small pool to have that pop up. So it'd be nice to understand both here and in general why that isn't part of the process of verifying a valid applicant. The other thing is, if the employer is not going to verify employment or some other questions, DOR obviously knows, because they get each pay period money sent in. and we'd be able to tell, did that person actually work during that period of time? That would be an easy yes, no, that wouldn't have to require any analysis. We just want to verify. The other thing is, it'd be pretty easy for DOR to say, hey, this is not a person that we have any record of working in Minnesota because there's no money coming in off their income. And that's another flag that could be hit because it's pretty tough to not be living and working in Minnesota and have direct contact with Minnesotans during the pandemic. I mean, a lot of the questions and the unknowns push the envelope of what's happening across. And if Minute is not complying with the state Official Records Act here, then how do we know they're complying anywhere? Because they're across all departments and they're key for us to doing our business as a state and effectively serving the people. So these areas that are of concern here, it'd be nice off the record later on finding out, is there some commonality across other audits so that we should maybe as a legislature look at clarifying for these agencies that yes, you have to comply by the Official Records Act and et cetera. So I didn't have a direct question to be answered now, but I hope we get some answers later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Randall. Once again, my congratulations on an exceptionally fine report that gets into the details and does not accept an apologist view, either for agencies or for the carelessness of the legislature in the ways in which they set up this program. There is only one stakeholder in the state of Minnesota, and that is the taxpayer. And any of these programs that the legislature sets up after apparently any number of hearings should have paid attention to details that are going to affect the lives of Minnesota workers, whether they were eligible or not eligible. And I hesitate to think that someone who is ineligible as a taxpayer would want the frontline worker pay, even if it's only, and I say that word only because $500 is a lot of money to some of us. But the taxpayers have a right, absolute right to hold and I'm looking particularly at the letter from the Department of Revenue. I don't know if anybody's here from them. I'm going to ask them about that, about why once again something was let slip through that should have been an easy enough thing to do as brushing your teeth in the morning. What do? You brush your teeth because that's how you begin your day. What do? You check the AGI to make sure that they've actually filed a tax return to make them eligible to begin with, to determine whether their income allows them to receive this payment. We were in a set of times of turmoil, but that does not excuse our carelessness with regard to the burden that we are placing on the taxpayer. If only eligible, and I don't know that you even have this kind of data, but if only eligible people, if only eligible workers were to receive or had received, including the ineligible dead people, were to have received the frontline worker pay, seems to me that that would have gone to the eligible people at a much, maybe not even 50% higher, but certainly higher, because those were the people that we were intending. The legislature claimed it was trying to help, and get through bad times, tough times, when people who, in order to work, have to go to work. That's the whole thing about, to me, about the frontline worker pay. And after that, you get into eligibility details and so forth. But we have known that it's not that difficult with both the rebate program we had in 2023, which ended up being taxable federally, although not in Minnesota, that we required a tax return in the legislation. We required a tax return to have been filed. We did the same thing with the cooperation of the Department of Revenue with the child tax credit in order to qualify for the safe harbor payments. You have to have filed a tax return. And that is, that is not a difficult thing, we are told by the Department of Revenue, in order to ascertain. On the other hand, when we gave a, when we put a lot of revenue in 2023 into making sure that taxpayers who had adjusted gross incomes of $100,000 or less were not going to pay anything on their Social Security incomes. And we also included public pensioners. What we did not include was a requirement that the taxpayer differentiate between whether they got Social Security and a pension or not. And the Department of Revenue correctly initially rejected some of those returns, rejected them because they could not determine whether they were on a coordinated plan or not. Since then, those pensioners, through their representatives and the Department of Revenue, have worked out something to make sure that the people who are eligible for that got that tax break. No different here. No different here, except here, one exception. It is the taxpayer, it is the frontline worker himself or herself that, through self-attestation, as you mentioned, has to know everything about their whether or not they are eligible. So I appreciate the good work. And in terms of, for the Department of Revenue now, and I'm sure they'll say this, that there was no requirement to list the AGI. It should have been an internal policy of the Department of Revenue to require that. But they're following the letter of the law. Where did the carelessness happen? It happened in the legislature, and we should not be apologizing we should not be the apologists for the legislature after all those hearings and coming up with, even on that one point, such carelessness. So you have my gratitude for, once again, a very fine report. It's not a pretty report. We don't find fault with those who legitimately thought they were eligible. We find a great deal of fault with those who thought they were defrauding the one stakeholder in this state, and that is the Minnesota taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Rest. Just thank you as always for your support. And I think you are correct that some of the things we heard from the agencies was that, it is not a requirement to file a tax return to be eligible for this program, right? But the individual does have requirements regarding the adjusted gross income. And so how do we reconcile that? Similarly, as you've heard, there was not a requirement to confirm the 120 hours in person in close proximity with the employer. So, I mean, we have heard the criticisms from the agencies as well in terms of we did things they did not do, or we expected things that weren't in the letter of the law. I mean, I would also note that the law does not say, definitely stop fraud. But I would expect that we all think we should try to stop fraud, whether or not it says that in the law. So, I think it's a reasonable assumption for agencies to confirm the eligibility to the extent possible, or I forget the exact language here. Well, as soon as it's to the extent possible, right? As much as possible. And so again, I think there's a give and take between the legislature and the executive branch. I think we all had the same goal. I think everybody in this room wanted as much as possible, wanted to maximize the amount of frontline worker payment that went to eligible applicants. Period. I truly believe everybody had the same goal in this room, as long as there are no fraudsters in this room. And I think people make choices along the way. One thing that you'll also hear and see in the letters from the agencies is this urgency, this feeling of urgency of, we had to get this payment out as soon as possible. And to that, we would say, yes, there was urgency around it. But we will also note that the appropriation was still available for 6 months after the last payment was made. And so while we appreciate the agency's, interest in getting the payments out to the eligible folks, we think it would have been prudent to take a little more time, do a risk-based approach, a risk-based testing of some of the items that we were able to identify. Thank you.
I have 3 quick questions before we go to the agencies. First, was there any demographic information collected either on the eligible ones that did receive payments or ineligible ones? Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Yes, quite a bit of demographic information, birth date, name, physical address, employer address. You're talking, I think, gender, I think race as well. So yeah, quite a bit.
And anywhere in the legislation or was there notwithstanding clauses, cross-referencing data practices statutes or any other boilerplate anti-fraud statutes? Was there anything in there that waived or waivers notwithstanding exceptions, any of that in the law? Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was a data practices subdivision here that allowed the agencies to share data across so that, Dolly could get information from revenue and from deed. So there's specific allowances for that.
There were authorizations for sharing, but not any exceptions to data practices requirements.
As far as I know, Mr. Chair, thank you. Yeah, correct, as far as I can tell.
And then finally, if there is specific evidence of fraud, I'm thinking people who died before they applied, that it would be the Ramsey County attorney is that the correct reference then? Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will be submitting reports to the Ramsey County attorney, to the Attorney General's office, and to the FBI.
And that was my last question. So if it is someone who is out of state and you have money going across state lines, is that going to a federal prosecutor then?
Mr. Chair, that is our understanding also, since there was wire transfers, et cetera.
Are there any members online that have questions? We'll proceed to the agencies. I said we wanted to adjourn by 10. I know that folks have places to be at 11. We'll try to go for at least 15 more minutes to make sure we provide the agencies with that. And I know people may have to go and log on, but I want to make sure we're giving time for the response. So Department of Labor and Industry, Nicole Blissenbach, Commissioner. Welcome, and state your name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Nicole Blissenbach. I serve as the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, and I had the distinct honor of leading the implementation of the Minnesota Frontline Worker Pay Program. Thank you for the opportunity to provide remarks today in response to the Office of Legislative Auditor's report. I've also submitted a written response on behalf of Labor and Industry that can be found at page 31 of the report. The Frontline Worker Pay Program law, which was signed into law 2 years after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic began, was a one-time program that provided well-deserved and long-awaited recognition to so many of Minnesota's frontline workers for the extraordinary sacrifices they made during the pandemic. The state agencies charged with building and implementing the Frontline Worker Pay Program worked together to execute a complex program in the manner intended and directed by the legislature. The legislation, which guided our implementation at every turn, was long awaited and the result of considerable legislative compromise. In fact, after 2 full sessions of debate, this program had near unanimous support from the Minnesota legislature. Everyone involved expected this program to be executed quickly and with low barriers for applicants to ensure that no frontline worker was left unrecognized. The state delivered in this regard. DLI believes that many of the findings in the OLA report are not supported by the language or the intent of the legislation or the data contained in the applications and collected throughout the program. The overarching theme of the findings is that the issue is with the program itself, not how it was implemented. The first recommendation in the report concerns risk analysis by the legislature when establishing programs like this type of program. DLI agrees that it is important for the legislature to consider risk while developing legislation. However, DLI also believes that the legislature fully considered the risk of this Frontline Worker Pay Program and chose to proceed knowing that some risk did exist. The legislature was fully informed of DLI's plans for program implementation and appropriately balanced the need for payments to quickly reach frontline workers with the need to prevent payments to ineligible applicants. During the conference committee discussion of this program, I testified that DLI would not automatically reach out to employers to verify employment or work conditions for applicants. I noted that employer verifications would be too onerous and resource intensive to administer effectively and efficiently, especially with the incredibly high volume of applications that were anticipated. My testimony made it clear that not only did the legislation not require employer verification of eligibility, but that with the resources available and timing desired, it would not allow it. The risk was clearly communicated and understood. Similarly, the legislature recognized that some eligibility criteria were not independently verified by the state, therefore requiring applicant self-attestation. My testimony addressed eligibility criteria that were independently verifiable by state agencies, things like employment for at least 120 hours, things like not receiving more than 20 weeks of unemployment insurance, and things like adjusted gross income under a certain amount. That those things, for the most part, could be determined using data in the state's possession. But other eligibility criteria would not be independently verifiable, namely the inability to telework and the requirement that the applicant have worked in close proximity to individuals outside the person's home. My testimony in that conference committee made it clear that the legislation as written allowed for DLI to rely on applicant self-certification for those certain criteria. Additionally, the legislature understood that components of the understand that components of the legislation were not independently verifiable and that gave the charge to the agencies to verify to the extent possible. The next finding concerns payments that the Office of Legislative Auditor believes were provided to applicants who were not eligible and to applicants whose eligibility OLA could not determine. DLI disagrees with the extent of this finding and the approach utilized by the OLA in reaching it. The report improperly concludes that to be determined eligible for frontline worker pay, an applicant's eligibility needed to be verified by the applicant's employer. To that end, when an employer did not respond or responded with "don't know" to the survey distributed by OLA, they concluded that the applicant's eligibility could not be confirmed. This conclusion ignores that each applicant passed the independently verifiable eligibility checks and certified that they satisfied the eligibility criteria. And there was no evidence to contradict that certification. As I previously testified, the frontline worker pay legislation did not include employer verification of eligibility. Rather, the legislation intentionally provided eligibility criteria that were independently verifiable and others that required self-certification. There was specific testimony throughout the legislative process by advocates and bill authors that the law should not require or rely on employer verification of the eligibility of workers for the payments. In the end, the Frontline Worker Pay Program did not make payment contingent on employers' verification. Given the direction in the legislation to make payments to eligible workers as soon as practicable, the size of the applicant pool, over 1.2 million applicants, and the amount of the appropriation we received to administer the program, verifying applicant eligibility through employer contact would not have been practical or possible. Even if we set aside the non-responses to the survey, given the language in the Frontline Worker Pay Program and the legislative history, DLI does not believe it could have denied payment to an applicant if the employer and the applicant disagreed about the eligibility criteria of working in close proximity outside of the applicant's home or inability to telework. The agencies were not directed to develop a procedure that would allow for an applicant due process to dispute the employer's response. And given that the program came years after the start of the pandemic, it's hard to imagine how such a dispute process would have been possible or practicable. What evidence could the employer have presented other than testimony about work duties and the employee's lived experience? I also want to remind you that the program was set up in a way where no one was paid until all eligibility was determined. So any dispute process would have delayed the entire program. The audit heavily relied upon employer surveys for verification of the criteria. DLI feels strongly that the employer survey methodology used by the OLA is not reliable and should not be used as a basis to determine that an applicant was ineligible for payment. The survey did not follow standard practices for ensuring representative and reliable data. The survey methodology included no criteria around who at the employer could serve as a representative and respond to the survey. The survey was not targeted to the applicant's supervisor, so there was no assurance of knowledge of the applicant's work environment, leading to sampling error in the survey data. The surveys were completed up to 4 years after the work was performed, which could lead to recall bias. Employers may have also mistakenly motivated in their response to avoid liability for workers' compensation or unemployment insurance claims. The employers were not statutorily required to complete the survey, and the number of don't know responses is indicative of the responding employer's lack of motivation to research accurate responses. Further, employers were not.
Commissioner,
Oh.
we have the 8-page report. Your letter, we can read that. So if you could summarize maybe, and I'll just say in 20 years on this commission, I've never had an 8-page response to a audit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will talk a little bit about the fraud projections. The report outlines 3 possible projection scenarios. The projection scenario of 0.2% payments to ineligible applicant is the most accurate and defensible scenario because it does not rely on the employer survey results alone in determining that an applicant is ineligible for payment. Regarding fraud, I do want to touch on that. DLI implemented an extensive fraud prevention program that deterred, identified, and prevented payments to fraudulent applicants. The goal was to reduce incidents by fraud by developing protocols that made fraud attempts difficult and fraud attempts unlikely. The OLA report confirms the success of DLI's fraud prevention efforts, finding an incredibly small percentage of applicants with a fraud indicator. In the course of the 16th-month audit, the OLA identified 140 applications with an OLA-identified fraud indicator. While I agree that the goal should be to eliminate all fraud, in a program that processed over 1 million direct payments, this represents less than a fraction of 1%. DLI is incredibly proud of the fraud prevention strategies developed and implemented for the Frontline Worker Pay Program. I do want to also note that we used a number of fraud indicators, in fact, more than the Office of Legislative Auditor used during the audit, including suspicious email patterns, high-risk email domains, high-risk bank account numbers, UI imposter and hijacked codes, duplicate bank accounts, unusual address patterns, and a number of additional fraud indicators. In conclusion, the Frontline Worker Pay Program was successful, first of its kind, one-time program that effectively delivered timely recognition to more than 1 million applicants. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide remarks in response to the report, and I am happy to respond to any questions.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and due to time, you can respond to the committee offline. You were found to be not compliant with the state's Official Records Act. What other areas and programs is Dolly not compliant with the state Official Records Act? And you can give us a list. I assume it will take you extensive time to list them all. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, as far as I know, the Department of Labor and Industry has never been found to be not compliant with the Official Records Act. I will note that the finding related to the subcontractors retaining data, we disagree with the Office of Legislative Auditor that that data related to the questions that were used in the knowledge-based authentication were relevant or were necessary for the program. The knowledge-based authentication questions include things like, what color was the car you drove in 1995? That question and that answer did not help us determine identity of an applicant. What helped us determine the identity of the applicant was the information the applicant provided for the KBA quiz and the results of the quiz, which were retained by the subcontractor.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have the time to debate specifically and argue, but if you're found by the auditor to not be compliant and your excuse is, well, there are vendors, many programs have vendors. It is our department's job to make sure the vendors and the data involved, the buck stops with the department. And I'd be interested in what other areas that you don't have compliance because you're not verifying and enforcing that the contractors are actually complying. So I look forward to an extensive report coming back to the committee. Thank you.
Representative Anderson.
I'll be very quick. I want to just first start out and say that the legislative auditor did not say that 40% were ineligible. They said 40% couldn't be determined. Okay, so I want to point that out. I also, we have a lot of faith in the legislative auditor. We have a lot of faith in this process. And the last time someone came in here was the head of the Met Council and argued and disputed findings and said they did it wrong. And so that, you know, it was over the light rail debacle, okay, from the Met Council. So this is the second time. So anytime someone comes in or commissioner and is so defensive, it leads me to believe that there's even worse problems out there. So I want to point that out. And I'm not going to say anymore. We have other testifiers. Thank you.
Senator Crand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. There's so many issues that I have that we don't have time for. Two questions. Dolly you just described an extensive fraud identification and process that you highlighted some of the criteria in which you looked at. What were the number of payments that you stopped? And what referrals did you make to law enforcement? So that's one question.
Commissioner Blissenbach.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So we have estimates of how many payments we prevented in going to fraudulent applications. I think it's a conservative estimate would be about 2 million that we were able to identify based on our fraud indicators that we prevented going out. I did have conversations with law enforcement throughout the program, and in fact, those conversations helped inform some of the fraud prevention strategies that we utilized in the program. In addition to law enforcement, we also had many conversations with both the Department of Revenue and DEED about the fraud prevention efforts they use in the tax program and in the UI program. Those were also baked into the fraud prevention strategies we used in this. And I think the success of that strategy is shown by the fact that the auditor identified 140 applications out of 1.025 million that contained a fraud indicator. The audit did not say that those applications are fraudulent, but that they have a fraud indicator, and 140 out of 1.025 million.
Senator Grant.
Thank you. And Commissioner, so we only read through and able to glance through, but there was a common theme through all the agencies that this is unprecedented times, and the agencies had difficulty and good business practices and the sense of urgency that we didn't follow some of those. What activities couldn't be performed because of COVID? Because the agencies, at my understanding, at that point, clearly were either all working at home or maybe even already starting to come back to work. I don't see anything in here that for any of the agencies in attendance that there should have been any impediment to put forth or to execute great business practices to be good stewards of our funds. They were either working at home or they're working in their offices. And I don't see anything that required physical verification of facilities, properties, or anything. So what did that work period in time impede or stop you from doing any facet of or task within in executing good business practices for this program?
Commissioner Blissenbach.
And Chair Representative, or Chair and Senator, I think I disagree with the premise that we didn't implement an incredibly comprehensive fraud prevention program. We did. And I think that is shown by the fact that so few applications with fraud indicators were identified. So we did put a lot of thought into this program. We implemented that comprehensive fraud strategies, and I think we were successful in preventing the vast majority of fraud that was applied to the program. I think I will also say that people worked incredibly hard. My staff put in more hours than I've ever seen on a program. We were given an appropriation for 1 year. That appropriation then ended. This was a one-time program, and we put our hearts and soul into this program. So I just want to say that. And this recognition went out to workers who deserved it for putting their lives at risk.
Representative Greenman, virtually.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I apologize for everything virtual. Just one quick question, because I think it's been raised, and I think one of the assessments as we think about the dollars, both the dollars that went out to workers and the dollars that it cost to implement the program. Do you have a sense to implement sort of the additional employer verification in a way that provided those due process concerns? Do you have an estimate about how much that would cost in addition to the administrative costs that you already expended on the program?
Commissioner Blissenbach.
Chair Hansen, Representative, I think that's a hard question, because I think I'm not sure what bulk postage would cost, but if we had to mail a survey or call every employer for all 1.2 million applicants, and then receive that survey back along with the time, I would guess our appropriation was about 11 million. I would guess that it would need to have been at least 50 million in order to do that. And I think the program would have definitely taken a year and a half or upwards of that. And again, like I mentioned, the appropriation was provided for 1 year.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up, which is, or one quick actually sort of statement of, I think if you match that with when we talk about the potential ineligibility of folks who over or underestimated the proximity of the amount of hours they were in proximity. I think that again, there's a policy question there that we made about would we rather have appropriated 50 or however much it was million more dollars in agency overhead versus taking that risk that that a set of folks self-certified may have been under that 120 hours. So again, I think as we think about this and as we sort of look back and think about the policy decisions we made, I do think that there's a risk there too of adding when we think about that eligibility and increasing the cost of the program, which we also spent a lot of time debating. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're going to move to the, if both Commissioner Marquardt and Commissioner Rowe could come forward and Commissioner Rowe's okay. Yeah. I think the deed commissioner is available for questions if people have any afterwards. So welcome, Commissioner Marquardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs, member of the commission. I am Paul Marquardt, the Commissioner of Revenue, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to respond to the OLA report on the frontline workers. And I must say, in my years in the legislature, I have greatly respected and admired the work of the Office of Legislative Auditor in what they do in improving government and improving accountability in government, and appreciate this report very much. Having said that, there are a few things that we disagree with on some of the conclusions here, and I basically want to do that in 3 points. I know for time I will go as quickly as possible. So number one is the context of the legislation is crucial here. I think it's really, really important. We were in an unprecedented peacetime emergency. We had a COVID-19 that people didn't even know what the results and the seriousness was. People were on the front lines working, literally putting their lives at risk. I remember I was in the legislature, of course, at the time, and I remember hearing testimony where you had nurses who were living in campers in their driveways outside their home because they didn't want to go inside and potentially expose their children to COVID-19. It was that serious. And the number one goal was to get those payments in recognition out to those workers. And so, you know, you saw words in the legislation like extraordinary circumstances, as soon as practicable, to the extent possible, to the extent feasible. So I think the legislature was recognizing the difficulty in determining eligibility, that maybe the state and all the agencies wouldn't have all of the data available. And as Ms. Randall said, which left some discretion to the agencies. Now, I will say that agencies don't always like discretion. But in this case, we had to balance and had to do discretion because the number one goal was to get funding to all frontline workers who put their lives on the line. So point two, I want to talk about the finding number 3, that the Department of Revenue did not verify the AGI for all applicants. So as Senator Rest very accurately stated, and excellent comments there, is that a tax return, the M1 form, is the only way to verify adjusted gross income. It's the only way. And unlike the one-time rebate, child tax credit, Senator Rest mentioned, this legislation did not require a tax return for either 2020 or 2021. Even though there's income limits there on AGI for this program, there was no. So what we know is that 97.3% of those who got payments did have a tax return. So there we could verify for sure the AGI. So that left 2.7%, about 27,000 of those who received the payment. So the Department of Revenue, we could have said, all right, we're not going to, they don't have for sure AGI. We just absolutely can't verify it. We're not going to allow them that payment. We know that wasn't realistic, and that would not have been to the letter of the law, because there's a number of reasons why someone who performed these services as a frontline worker might not have had to file a tax return in 20 or 21. Number one, they might not have met the income threshold to be required to file. You might have been a North Dakota resident who had employment in Minnesota that certainly we wouldn't have that. And there was also folks who came in from out of state that worked the required number of hours that also would not have had a tax return. And so to the extent possible, what we did at the Department of Revenue is a couple things. We looked at W-2 forms. A W-2 form was able to verify that that person had employment in Minnesota. This is information that would have come from employers, and also the self-certification. We were able to do that. And we also know that of that 2.7%, just looking at 2021 returns, that over 80%, just based on normal returns, that over 80% of that 2.7% would have been under the thresholds to qualify for the program. And also, if you look at page 17, there's in that first kind of projection in the OLA report of that 32% that could not determine eligibility, it said in a footnote, only 0.14% of the applicants did not have a tax report on file. There's also no way we could determine, subtractions above the line, subtractions on AGI and so forth. So in summary, we really felt that, first of all, we take our legal responsibility at the Department of Revenue very, very seriously. And we followed the law in this case. So to the extent possible, we used our professional judgment to go through the letter and spirit and intent of the law and getting those dollars out and doing the best we could to determine AGI in a very difficult situation where you didn't have all of the available information. And the comments by Senator Rest are right on in that, and also a recommendation that I would have is that in any future program that we require a tax return that would have to be filed by a specific time, and then for sure we would know that. And I also agree, the number one stakeholder is the taxpayer. That's absolutely crucial. So point and final number 3 is that we take the reporting and investigation of these potentially illegal activities very seriously. And we are in the process right now of even recouping those funds of those who might have inappropriately received that. We are in the process of recouping from those that have been sent to us, and we will continue to do that to the extent of the law. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And well, it's good to see you in person again. What percentage of those that applied had no withholding whatsoever during the period of time? Because if you work in the state of Minnesota, there has to be withholding.
So, Mr. Chair, Representative Quam, I don't have that number for you. I'm sorry.
Commissioner, you and I both voted for this law. And, over the years, it's interesting. When we provide explicit instruction, the legislature is told that they're doing micromanaging. When we provide great discretion, we're told that we didn't provide enough direction. And then we all become at fault. And I think I do agree with the context, and what people have said is we wanted to get money to the workers. And I agree with what Senator Rest had said, is that when any money that was taken improperly was money that didn't go to the workers who were eligible. So if we don't do better over and over, we lose faith and we lose trust and confidence. So I appreciate your last comment of following up, because I think that Minnesotans would be accepting of error, right? If there's error occurring or some confusion and understand but they're not accepting of fraud. And so if there's a way to recover money that was improperly, if there's people who were explicitly going into the system to obtain money that had nothing to do with, they were not frontline workers. If we have that, I think we need to make sure that we are following up with the law and we are trying to recover that money. And that probably requires some additional just spot checking in each of the agencies to make sure that we're testing that system. We do learn from these things. Hopefully we don't have another pandemic again. But we're seeing with any time we're giving out money, you know, we have the deed money, the dolly money, the ag money, even DNR money, that how do you get money out and make sure it's going to its intended purpose? Because if it's not fulfilling what the elected representatives are intending for it to do. We're all responsible. But our role in as the Legislative Audit Commission, speaking for our colleagues in the legislature, is we have the auditor to find these things. We can't manage by audit. The auditor can find things and the auditor can give recommendations. And sometimes we choose to follow those recommendations. Sometimes the executive branch chooses. What's intriguing about this response is it's, you know, very deliberately challenging the recommendations of the audit. I would encourage each of the agencies to just go back, make sure we're checking, double checking, making sure that if that fraud occurred, that we're catching it and correcting it. And that hopefully we never have to go through this again. But we learn from other grants for the future. Commissioner, any comment?
Well, Chair Hansen, I agree with that. The Department of Revenue, we always talk about that the experiences that a taxpayer, a resident has with a government agency reflects on their confidence that they're going to have in that government agency, but even more important, the faith and confidence they're going to have in democracy. So we're in the democracy business when it comes to state agencies, and making sure that every tax dollar is spent according to law and without waste or fraud is crucial to the Department of Revenue, and I believe all agencies. So very much agree with your statements, Chair Hansen.
A couple of comments, Senator Drazkowski and Senator Krant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I was heartened by Senator Rest's comments. I understand, Commissioner, what you're talking about. And I agree the taxpayer is the main thing here. And we have to go back to that. And that's why we're here, is to be accountable to the taxpayer. So if there was fraud, waste, and abuse in this program, it appears very clearly there was, you know, dead people getting payments, people getting double payments. I'm still trying to dig into the report, but some of the automatic electronic transfers that were trying to happen. So with those happening, Commissioner, I mean, wouldn't you agree that we're not holding in this process, however the finger is going to be pointed at the legislature and the executive branch or whoever, don't we have to admit that the taxpayer was not the number one focus here? It seems that, to use one of my favorite farm metaphors, Commissioner, it seems that many believe that if somebody was prevented from getting this money, that was a tragedy, rather than holding the focus on the main thing and the main deal, and that is accountability of the taxpayer. I mean, wouldn't you agree that we collectively failed in this program?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Drazkowski, I would not agree with that. I think, you know, going back to the legislation was to recognize folks who had gone above and beyond the call of duty. And I mean, you remember in March and April of 2020, we didn't know how this spread. We didn't know for sure how serious, and yet you had people working on the front lines. And it was much overdue. This was a year and a half after this broke out, and we'd been trying to get this legislation through for a long, long time. So those taxpayers or frontline workers really needed this recognition. I also think that all of the protocol that went through, as I think testified before, really prevented. I mean, a lot of times you can never show things you prevented. You know, like when there's a program out there, you don't know how many prevented this from happening or that. You can't do that. But from what we know is that a huge amount of fraud was prevented through the procedures and protocols that were used.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. Well, Commissioner members, you know, when we are, and we were as a legislature inherently in this discussion back then, creating the excuse or the desire to forget about, or I can't think of the right words here, but to dismiss some of the things that are core important. The law, the focus again on the taxpayer being accountable to them. When we are creating excuses for our behavior, we got to do this quickly because you know, we don't know what's happening. Somebody's gonna get sick, you know, or we're creating excuses. And when we're creating excuses, we're violating other things. And in this case, I think it was probably the law, and it was probably the taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Krant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, the concerns I have, you know, kind of globally is that if this was the only time we had seen agencies that we don't think put in good business practices to the fullest extent possible, data retention policies that would have allowed the legislative auditor to go out and verify eligibility, those things should be basic. I think the chair said explicitly, when he tell you to do it, we shouldn't be making all the rules. Then when we don't explicitly say, well, you didn't explicitly tell us to do it. Senator Rest, I think, covered is like, we have got good business standard practices to be great stewards of public funds baked in. I find it troubling just in the contractual side that, well, we didn't have data retention explicitly called out. The self-attestation information was not retained, that we believe, well, once they told us they were good, we don't need to go back and verify it. Each of those are elements of the ability to go back and verify that you did your job. And I would look at it from the perspective of, you've got to prove to the citizens you did a great job. The legislative auditor, in many cases, I trust and value the work they do. In many cases, I think they're pretty lenient on agencies and giving you the benefit of the doubt in many cases. And yet it still looks like you've implemented a program where they couldn't verify that 40% were actually qualified. And so that's a big number. That's $205 million of a $500 million program. Senator Rest said, well, what would that have been? Well, that would have been $833 for every eligible worker based on the data we had to validate that's who received those payments. We do believe they're important. But I don't see, I'm just struggling continuously. We've got agency after agency that comes before this body. Most are not as hostile in the rebuttal as this one, but they're basic good standard practices that should be in place every day. And we don't see that. And every single thing you do should be great to be put forth and great stewards of the funds. And so we didn't see those things. We didn't see the discovery in the report that said, well, the agency's already doing all these things. We're doing revenue recapture wherever we can, because I happen to know that one pretty well, that we have the lowest cost opportunity once something's suspect to have them come and improve, right? We could do subsequent follow-ups. Sounds like we're doing it now, but my concern is that it didn't appear any of these things or programs were in place prior to the legislative auditor. What if they wouldn't have done a review? What review would the agencies have done? Those are the things that I worry about, that we see this continually, and then there's no accountability. So I get it, your employees are working hard. You know, this whole COVID unprecedented is not an excuse. Our workers were there, we're working every day, they're working from home. Maybe they had more time because they had no commutes. But we've heard it not just in this program, but every single report, almost exclusively that comes before this body, has the same thing. And then a decade from now, we'll do it again. Boy, we hope we're better. It should be the standard. Our Office of the Legislative Auditor is going to be really thorough. Build every program based on that and existing state statute. That's what we should be focusing on. So thank you.
Commissioner? Respond?
Chair Hansen and Chair Coran, I mean, I'm not going to respond to other agencies, but what we did at the Department of Revenue, I think, is what other agencies did, is in this information, and I'm going to go back to that 2.7% of those who did not have a tax return on file. How would you have handled that? I mean, the idea is that you are trying to, we use the best information available to, and that's what I think every agency did, is try to use what is the best information available to make sure that everyone that was a frontline worker got that payment. And so every department used their own, we used the W-2 form. So to make sure they had employment in that area. We used the, self-certification as part of that. We also know just statistically that over 80% probably fell within that range. I mean, it just, we were trying to do something perfect in an imperfect environment that we were dealt. And that, I think all the agencies felt that. I mean, the bottom line is we wanted to get that information out. So anyway.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Craig.
Commissioner, so in your world, tax world, all of the people you serve are required to retain documents for further analysis and audit and updates, right? That's what your job is. And in this case, the retention of all information would have aided in that follow-up audit. And so in that case, then we would be able to go back and verify all that information. That's my point. So we could do better. We could have verified everything. We could have retained all those documents. So thank you.
I just remind folks that, the reports can be heard in committees and have further testimony from folks. I have two members on the list I do want to get done. So I have Representative Greenman and then Senator Rest, and we'll call it a day.
Thank you. And this is just very brief for the commissioner, because I think what I heard you, and I don't know, I'm not on tax committee, but I think I heard you say that one of the groups of folks who can't, who wouldn't have filed an M1 are people whose incomes are too low. And so I'm just wondering, one, if you could give, what's the threshold of folks? Because I certainly don't think we intended to say you have to meet an income minimum. I think we are trying to make sure. So what would be the threshold of that if you didn't file an N1, and if we had required the tax withholding, how would we have ensured that we were getting those eligible people?
Mr. Chair, Representative Greenman, so on the income level, it would be those below the standard deduction and dependent exemption. So the standard deduction back in 20 and 21 would have probably been around $27,000 for a married filer, and then another, $4,400, whatever that might have been per child. So it could have been, if you've got 3 children, it could be 40,000. Now, if you were withholding, you probably would file for a refund, so basically that's the income, whatever the standard deduction plus basically any other deductions that you might have had, that would have, but for sure it'd be around 27,000 for a married couple without children.
Representative Greenman. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner Markwart, for your comments, particularly if we do find ourselves in a similar situation in the future, the Department of Revenue is going to weigh in with the legislature about getting it right the first time. And it seems to me ironic and actually against the law, but that the legislative auditor cannot audit the legislature with regard to its the policies that it passes, whether or not according to the mission of a legislative auditor in the law, which is to save taxpayers money. One of those missions is exactly that. And yet, we prevent the legislative auditor's office because in a sense, they are an employee of the legislature from looking back at our carelessness, at our mistakes, and pointing them out to us. And instead, the burden goes on the agencies that we ask to implement an not just an imperfect law, but a careless law on something that is so absolutely important, and that was serving those workers during that time. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to be an apologist for the agencies, but I'm not going to be an apologist for the carelessness of the legislature when they had the time. They spent so much time, worrying about whether someone was going to be eligible or not, rather than having a broad definition of eligibility, which I would have supported and did support. But it wouldn't have taken but a request for the Department of Revenue to then say, well, you know what? You really should find a way of verifying the income, and you can do it simply by a tax return or the W-2, W-4, whatever. And we probably wouldn't be having that part of this discussion today. We do not want, however, Ms. Randall, the legislative auditor to turn and investigate us. We will not, we don't do that, but but we don't actually have an agency that is empowered to look at just the bare bones adequacy of our policy with regard to budget and revenue. And I think that's important. Unfortunate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Anderson.
I'll be very quick. I just want to, this was in 2002. This was long after the pandemic. Okay, and at least in the frontline workers, or yeah, 22. I had 100 employees who were frontline workers, and they worked except for the time that we were shut down for 3 months. So this is way past that. And out in the world of frontline workers, this was sort of a reward for being a frontline worker, rather than a pandemic payment for, like unemployment was, right? Okay, it was a reward. So I think that, as Senator Russ said, the taxpayers are the loser, but I think the bigger loser is the true frontline workers. And because they would have gotten more, I think it was surprising that they only got $500 some rather than over 1,000. I agree that we need to have more, the legislation. I wasn't part of the legislation, I was on the other end. But we need to be more specific. But what's really worrisome in my time coming back here in the last 2 years is we have had huge amounts of fraud in state agencies that were not, and I'm not necessarily more in the Department of Education, frankly, but huge amounts of fraud that were completely overlooked. And it happened with pandemic funds. It happened during this time when our state employees were working out of their house or, whatever. But it's huge dollars. And we need to be back to normal. And as commissioners and a state agency, we need to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen in the future, because it's not acceptable. And the public is losing faith in government. And that's almost worse than the dollars that are lost, because that's hard to get back. So I just encourage the agencies, the employees, the commissioners, let's do way better in the future. Let's be aware. If the legislation is written poorly, as people have said, testify to it and go above and beyond. Go what just the letter of the law says. Go above and beyond. So thank you.
We are adjourned.